All right, let's dive deep into the Napoleonic Wars. We're going to be using the Epic History YouTube video, Napoleonic Wars 1804, 1814, all parts, to guide our exploration. But we're going to do more than just battles and dates. We're going to really try to understand like what made this period so pivotal.
Well, I mean, the French Revolution had already really shaken Europe,
Mhm.
but Napoleon's rise was like, it really was like pouring gasoline on the fire. He went from basically obscurity to emperor in just a decade.
Which is incredible when you think about it, right?
Yeah, like how did he pull that off? What were the key factors that, not only allowed him to seize power, but then to hold on to it?
I think it was a combination of factors. Obviously the old order was collapsing. That created, a huge power vacuum. And Napoleon, I mean, he was a brilliant military strategist. He was able to exploit that instability. But he also understood propaganda. And
Yeah.
he understood public image. He presented himself as like a champion of the revolution and like a strong leader for France. So not just a military genius, but a very savvy politician as well. But his ambitions didn't stop at the borders of France, did they?
No, definitely not. Napoleon's rise, it really threatened the balance of power in Europe,
Mm.
especially for Great Britain. They couldn't match him on land, so they spearheaded a series of coalitions, uniting other powers like Austria, Russia against him.
Okay, so it's like a giant game of Risk, with
Mhm.
with entire nations as the playing pieces. It's pretty crazy. What can you tell us about the Third Coalition and their strategy against Napoleon?
So the Third Coalition, I mean, their goal was to contain Napoleon
Right.
by attacking, on multiple fronts, basically. But Napoleon had these military innovations, in particular the core system. It really gave him a decisive edge.
Right. Instead of one like big cumbersome army, he divided his forces into these independent corps.
Right, each of them capable of operating, on their own.
Okay, let's unpack this core system a little bit. Why was it so revolutionary?
Well, the core system, it basically revolutionized warfare
Hmm.
by enabling, speed, flexibility, logistical efficiency. These self-contained units, they could move quickly. They could live off the land and then concentrate for battle when they needed to. So,
So it gave Napoleon a huge advantage, right, over his enemies, who were still using like the traditional slower methods of warfare.
yeah, exactly.
I mean, it's fascinating like how this innovation that was born out of necessity really became like a blueprint for modern armies.
Totally. Napoleon's genius wasn't just about winning battles. It was about like reshaping the very structure of
Yeah.
warfare and the core system. It's a perfect example of that.
So with this new system in place, Napoleon's ready to take on the Third Coalition. And one of the most famous clashes, of course, is the Battle of Austerlitz. I mean, this wasn't just a victory for Napoleon, it was like a crushing blow to the coalition. So what made Austerlitz such a decisive moment?
Well, Austerlitz is, I mean, it's a classic example of Napoleon's tactical brilliance.
Mm.
He deliberately feigned weakness. He lured the Austro-Russian forces into this trap
Mm.
and then unleashed, this devastating attack on their center, achieving, I mean, a complete and utter victory. I mean, the image of, the soldiers fleeing across the frozen ponds and the French artillery, like, targeting the ice, it's chilling.
It really captures the brutality of war and
Yeah.
Napoleon's willingness to exploit any advantage, right? But even as he was dominating on land, another power is rising at sea. What can you tell us about the British victory at Trafalgar and its significance?
Well, the British victory at Trafalgar, led by Admiral Nelson, it really established British naval supremacy for the next century. I mean, this created a fascinating kind of dichotomy, right? Napoleon ruled the land, but Britain controlled the seas. And this tension between land and sea power will be a constant factor throughout the Napoleonic Wars.
So you have these two titans, right, clashing. Napoleon's reshaping the map of Europe. Britain's holding the keys to the sea. I mean, it really is like a giant game of chess with the fate of nations hanging in the balance.
Yeah, and just like in a chess match, like each move has consequences, right? So Austerlitz, it really solidified Napoleon's control over Europe and it allowed him to redraw borders,
Yeah.
to install his allies on thrones, even, dismantle the Holy Roman Empire. And this, of course, led to new tensions, particularly with Prussia.
Right. Prussia, up under the influence of figures like Queen Louise, they saw Napoleon's actions as a threat to their interests, right?
Yeah.
So can you tell us a little bit more about the events that pushed Prussia towards war with France?
Well, Queen Louise, I mean, she was a powerful figure in the Prussian court.
Yeah.
She really embodied this kind of Prussian patriotism, and she saw Napoleon's expansion as a direct threat. And then you had this diplomatic blunder with Hanover,
Uh-huh.
where Napoleon basically promised it to both Prussia and Britain.
Mm.
which further inflamed tensions.
It seems like Napoleon, despite all of his strategic brilliance, he sometimes made moves that really backfired, right?
Yeah, I mean, that's the thing about power. It can be intoxicating, right?
Right.
And Napoleon's successes might have led to, like, overconfidence and this, miscalculation with Hanover. It gave the war party in Prussia the upper hand.
Yeah.
And it pushed the nation towards a confrontation that they were really ill prepared for.
And that confrontation led to the twin battles of Jena and Auerstedt, which was just a crushing defeat for Prussia.
Yeah, I mean, it wasn't just a loss. It was a total collapse of their army and really a humiliation, I mean, on a national scale. Jena and Auerstedt showcased Napoleon's military genius, I mean, at its peak. But they also revealed Prussia's, strategic shortcomings. I mean, they declared war without coordinating with their allies, and their army was just tactically outmatched. So the result was a swift and devastating defeat. That left Prussia reeling, and Napoleon's grip on Europe even stronger.
But even in victory, I mean, there are these like glimpses of the human cost of war, you know? The epic history video, it mentions Napoleon reprimanding this young soldier for calling out forward,
Hmm.
before he'd even earned the right. And it talks about Marshal Ney's reckless charge and Murat's cavalry relentlessly pursuing, these fleeing Prussians.
Right, and these anecdotes, they remind us that behind, the grand narratives of empires and battles are these individual stories of, bravery, folly, and just the harsh realities of combat.
And the human cost of war was about to escalate even further as Napoleon turned his attention towards Russia, which was a formidable foe with vast resources and a determination to resist his advances.
Right, and so the stage is set for what would become, a real turning point in the Napoleonic Wars, a clash of titans that would really test Napoleon's limits and forever alter the course of European history. Well, the road to the Russian campaign, it was really paved with, these mounting tensions. And while the treaties of Tilsit, they brought a temporary peace, this forced alliance between France and Russia, it was inherently unstable.
It seems like Napoleon's continental system, which was, his attempt to cripple Britain's economy by blocking their trade, that really played a major role in this growing rift.
Oh, absolutely. I mean, the continental system caused, real economic hardship for Russia, and they resented being forced to comply with it. And Napoleon also continued to expand his influence in Eastern Europe, which, further alarmed Tsar Alexander VI.
So it was like a combination of economic pressure, territorial ambitions, and just this clash of personalities, right, that ultimately led to the breakdown of the alliance.
Exactly. And by 1812, I mean, the situation had just become untenable. And so Napoleon, believing that he could force Russia to submit, he assembled the Grande Armée, which was the largest army that Europe had ever seen, and marched eastward.
It's almost unimaginable the sheer scale of this invasion. The epic history video mentions over 600,000 men. I mean, that's a logistical nightmare even by today's standards.
I mean, it was a gamble of just epic proportions. Napoleon was confident in his military prowess, but he really underestimated the challenges of campaigning in the vast expanse of Russia. I mean, the long supply lines, the scorched earth tactic that the Russians employed, the relentless harassment of, Cossack cavalry, it all took a toll on the Grande Armée.
And then, of course, there's the infamous Russian winter, which was, a formidable foe in its own right.
Oh, absolutely. The Russian climate, I mean, it was a decisive factor. The harsh winters, with temperatures plummeting far below freezing, it proved devastating for Napoleon's troops, who were just ill-equipped for those kinds of conditions.
And the campaign was marked by a series of just brutal battles, Smolensk, Borodino, the burning of Moscow. I mean, these weren't just military engagements. They were tests of endurance, willpower. I mean, just the limits of human suffering.
Right. Smolensk and Borodino, I mean, they were costly victories for Napoleon. He won the battles, but his army was, significantly depleted. His supply lines were stretched thin. And then the burning of Moscow, which was orchestrated by the Russians themselves, it denied Napoleon the symbolic victory that he craved, and it left him stranded in this hostile city with, winter approaching.
So he was faced with this terrible dilemma, right? Stay in Moscow and risk being trapped by the winter, or retreat and this long, perilous journey back through this devastated landscape.
Yeah, Napoleon hesitated, which is, it's a rare moment of indecision for a man who was known for his decisiveness. But ultimately, he chose to retreat, and that decision really sealed the fate of the Grande Armée.
I mean, the retreat from Moscow was a catastrophe. I mean, just of unimaginable proportions. The epic history video paints this harrowing picture of starvation, disease, the relentless attacks by Cossacks and Russian troops. It's just hard to fathom, the suffering that those men endured.
It really is. And the Grande Armée, which was once a symbol of Napoleon's power, it was reduced to just a shattered remnant. I mean, the Berezina river crossing was
Yeah.
particularly disastrous.
Yeah.
Thousands perished in the icy waters or, fell victim to enemy attack.
It wasn't just a military defeat, it was a humanitarian crisis.
Exactly. Napoleon's gamble, it had backfired, I mean, spectacularly. And the invasion of Russia really marked a turning point in his fortunes. It exposed the limits of his power, and it really emboldened his enemies.
And with Napoleon weakened, I mean, his enemies saw an opportunity to strike back. And so the Sixth Coalition was formed, comprising Britain, Russia, Prussia, Sweden, and eventually Austria. And they united to finally break his grip on Europe.
Yeah, Napoleon's defeat in Russia, it really shattered that aura of invincibility that had surrounded him.
Yeah.
And it signaled to his opponents that he was not unbeatable, that his empire was vulnerable.
And this led to, this resurgence of resistance across Europe. I mean, people who had once accepted Napoleon's rule, they now saw, a chance to break free.
Exactly. The spirit of nationalism, which Napoleon had both exploited and fueled, now turned against him. And in Prussia, for example, military reforms, which were inspired by Napoleon's own innovations. They had created a more effective and motivated army, eager to avenge their earlier defeats.
So Napoleon was now facing this multi-front war. His enemies were emboldened, his own resources were depleted. It seems like the odds were really stacked against him.
Yeah, the situation was dire. But Napoleon was not one to give up easily. He returned to France, and despite the exhaustion of the nation, after years' war, he managed to raise new armies and prepare for a final showdown.
But even with, his military genius, could he really overcome such overwhelming odds?
Well, Napoleon, he knew that he couldn't win a war of attrition. He needed to strike quickly and decisively to divide his enemies and achieve a decisive victory before their full might could be brought to bear.
It was a high-risk strategy, a desperate gamble to try to salvage his empire.
Exactly. The final campaign was a series of rapid maneuvers and fierce engagements as Napoleon, sought to exploit any weakness in the Allied forces.
He was fighting for his survival, right? His back was against the wall. But even in these desperate circumstances, I mean, he showed flashes of the brilliance that had made him a legend.
Right, at Montereau, for example.
Yeah.
He personally cited the French cannons, just like he had at Lodi early in his career, and it led to a decisive victory. But it was a fleeting moment of triumph in a tide that was just inexorably turning against him.
So even as he was winning battles, the overall situation was deteriorating. His enemies were closing in, his resources were dwindling, and the French people, I mean, weary of war, they were losing faith.
Right. I mean, Napoleon was facing a crisis on multiple fronts, military, political, and even personal. He had to deal with betrayals from those he had once trusted, which, added another layer of complexity to an already desperate situation.
It's fascinating how the epic history video, it doesn't shy away from those personal betrayals. We hear about Talleyrand, his own foreign minister, working behind the scenes to undermine him.
Yeah, Talleyrand, he's a complex figure. He was a master of intrigue and political maneuvering, and he saw Napoleon's continued rule as a threat to France's future. And he believed that, negotiating with the Allies was the best way to secure peace and stability for the nation.
So even as Napoleon was fighting for his empire, the ground was shifting beneath his feet. His own inner circle was plotting against him, seeing him as a liability rather than a savior.
Right. The pressure was immense. Napoleon was trying to fight a war on multiple fronts while simultaneously navigating, this treacherous political landscape. It was a situation that would test even the most skilled and resilient leader.
And as the Allies closed in on Paris, Napoleon's grip on power, began to slip away. And his dreams of a European empire, they were crumbling, replaced by the harsh realities of defeat and betrayal.
Right. And in the fall of Paris, it was a symbolic and strategic blow. It signaled that Napoleon's power was broken, that his reign was coming to an end.
But what about Napoleon? I mean, how did he react to this final crushing defeat? Did he go down fighting, or did he, accept his fate?
I mean, it must have been just absolutely crushing, right? For a man who had conquered most of Europe, To face, I mean, it's such a complete reversal of fortune. So with the fall of Paris, and the Allied forces closing in, Napoleon he found himself with very few options. His attempts to rally his remaining troops and to march on Paris, they were met with resistance, not only from the advancing enemy, but also from a war-weary French population, and crucially from key figures within his own government.
Yeah, it's fascinating how even in his final hours, right, those closest to Napoleon, people who had been so instrumental in his rise, they recognized, that this was it. It was the end. I mean, they weren't just like abandoning a sinking ship. They were actively, steering France towards a new course.
I mean, they understood that further resistance would only lead to more bloodshed, more destruction, and Talleyrand, in particular, I mean, he played a pivotal role in negotiating Napoleon's abdication and ensuring a peaceful transition of power. It was a calculated move to protect France's interests and to prevent
Further devastation.
So after, I mean, years of epic battles, grand ambitions, a reshaped Europe, Napoleon's reign ends not with a bang, but with a whimper. A signed abdication, exile to Elba, and the restoration of the Bourbon monarchy. I mean, it's a pretty dramatic fall from grace for a man who once seemed invincible. Yeah, it's a stark reminder that even the most powerful empires can crumble. Right? I mean, Napoleon's story, it really is a classic tragedy, a tale of ambition, hubris, and ultimately, the limits of human power.
And the epic history video, it highlights the terms of Napoleon's abdication. He was allowed to retain the title of emperor. He got a small personal guard, and he was given rule over Elba, which is this tiny island off the coast of Italy. I mean, it wasn't exactly the French Empire, but it was a surprisingly generous deal.
Considering the circumstances, right? I mean, why wasn't he imprisoned or met with, a harsher punishment?
Well, the Allies, while they were determined to end Napoleon's reign, they also recognized the need for stability in Europe. And imprisoning or executing him, it could have sparked further unrest, further instability. And Elba, while it was small and insignificant compared to his former empire, it offered a way to kind of neutralize him without, making him a martyr. It was a pragmatic solution to a very complex problem.
But Elba couldn't contain a man like Napoleon for long. He escapes, he returns to France, and he rallies his supporters for this one last desperate attempt to regain power. The 100 Days War. I mean, it's like something out of a movie. It really is. And it's a testament to Napoleon's charisma and the lingering loyalty that he inspired in people. I mean, he managed to escape Elba, land in France, and march on Paris with a growing army, all without a shot being fired. I mean, it's a remarkable feat of leadership and just audacity.
But this time, his gamble fails. The Allies, united against him. They crush his forces at Waterloo, and that's the end, right? His reign is over once and for all.
Right. Waterloo marked the definitive end of the Napoleonic era. Napoleon was exiled again, this time to the remote island of St. Helena in the South Atlantic, where he died 6 years later.
So, I mean, what does it all mean? What is Napoleon's lasting legacy? Was he a hero, a villain, a force for progress, or an agent of destruction?
Well, I mean, Napoleon's legacy, it's incredibly complex and multifaceted, right? He was a brilliant military strategist, no question. He was a skilled administrator and a charismatic leader who inspired both intense loyalty and fierce opposition. And he left an indelible mark on Europe, not just through his conquests, but through his legal reforms, his modernization of government, and his role in spreading, the ideals of the French Revolution.
But his ambition also led to countless deaths and untold suffering. Millions perished in the wars he waged. And his quest for power ultimately destabilized Europe. Setting the stage for future conflicts.
Right, and it's important to remember that history isn't about, simple labels of good or bad, hero or villain. Napoleon was a product of his times. He was a complex figure who embodied both the revolutionary ideals of liberty and equality and the darker impulses of power and conquest. And his story it's a cautionary tale, right? It reminds us that even the most brilliant and ambitious individuals can be corrupted by power, and that the pursuit of glory often comes at a terrible cost.
Well, this deep dive has been a journey through, a really pivotal era in history, a time of upheaval, transformation, and ultimately, profound change. And we've explored Napoleon's meteoric rise, his military genius, his political maneuvering, his triumphs, his failures, and his lasting impact on the world. It's a story that continues to fascinate and inspire debate, even centuries later.
And the Napoleonic Wars, despite their devastation, they ushered in a new era for Europe, right? They helped spread these ideas of nationalism, liberalism, individual rights, ideas that would continue to shape the continent in the decades and centuries to come.
So while Napoleon's empire may have crumbled, the seeds of change that he sowed, they continued to grow and they transformed the political and social landscape of Europe.
Yeah, Napoleon's story, it's a reminder that history it's a tapestry, right? Woven from ambition, conflict, innovation, and the enduring human struggle for power and meaning and his legacy, like the era that he dominated. It's complex, it's contradictory, and ultimately, unforgettable. It challenges us to grapple with the complexities of leadership, the allure and the dangers of power, and the enduring human desire for both,
Hmm.
freedom and order.
Well, thank you for joining us on this deep dive into the Napoleonic Wars. We hope you've gained a deeper understanding of this complex and fascinating era, and perhaps you'll be inspired to explore it further on your own. Until next time, keep exploring, keep questioning, and keep diving